So let's get into it, okay? And here's our agenda for today. I couldn't help but avoid some dad jokes in there. So what we're going to go over is it's really just going to be kind of three parts. You know, I always try to schedule a long time for these trainings, but we almost certainly won't take up the full time. So the first part is, you know, where does MIPS come from, or MIPStery, if you will. You know, if you've ever done any of my trainings, you know I'm a big fan of context. You know, when you leave this training, you might not remember the details and percentages, but you will hopefully understand the context. That's why I like to spend some time on that. We'll also talk about what MIPS is meant to do, like how it works on a grand scale. So, you know, where does it come from? How does it work on a grand scale? And then we'll talk about how the individual scores are calculated. So kind of on the less grand scale, how it works. And obviously we'll have time for questions. We'll pause. And again, if you have anything to ask, just chat it up or unmute yourself and speak up. Sound good? Awesome. Okay. So let's start with the MIPStery. And if you've, again, attended some of my trainings on the history of healthcare, a thing that I firmly believe is that even the phrase "our healthcare system is broken" is weird because it implies that it was built. And it wasn't built, it was grown. And MIPS and the history of MIPS is a really good example of this, of how a lot of organic growth creates a need, and that need creates a new thing, and then there's organic growth and that need creates a new thing. So that's where MIPS fits in thematically in the American healthcare system. So let's start. The place we're going to start is 1997 with the Balanced Budget Act. And the 80s and well, the 80s is when we all kind of woke up to the fact that our healthcare costs were ballooning, and we started to try to control it. And the 90s are where we implemented a lot of stuff. So the 90s is where, you know, HMOs actually became kind of a popular thing, or at least popular might be the wrong word, but a widely used thing. And so the Balanced Budget Act was passed, you know, by Congress to slow growth. And what it did was it replaced what's called the MVPS, the Medicare Volume Performance Standard, with the Sustainable Growth Rate, or the SGR. And like I said, there's going to be an acronym salad. I apologize. But SGR, basically what it did was it tied the increase in Medicare expenditures per beneficiary, it tied that to the GDP growth. So the idea was, well, if we say, you know, per person, Medicare expenses are only going to grow as fast as the GDP, that will limit our costs, and that will make it so, you know, if the economy is doing well, we can spend more. If it's not, we have to restrain. So that was the theory. And what it did was it created what's called a conversion factor that would change payments to physicians for services, and that conversion factor would change year to year to match the SGR. Don't worry, I'll give you an example in a second. But this is the logic: is they're trying to control costs. That's what the balanced budget's all about. It's not about quality, it's just about cost. And the idea is they have this conversion factor. It changes every year so that it can match the sustainable growth rate they've decided on. Okay, let's give an example. So we're going to take a quick detour into why everyone hated SGR, sustainable growth rate. So here's the example I'm giving you. So it was implemented in 1997. And so in order to implement this, they looked at historical records. So they said, okay, and I'm using small numbers because I have to. So they say, okay, in the entire US, 20 patients got this procedure, and the procedure, we've been reimbursing $5 for it. So great, now we know what our budget is. So we're gonna set our budget for $105 for next year, which means if we're doing this by patient, by procedure, by beneficiary, like it's the SGR set up to do, that means the price is gonna be the same. The reimbursement cost is gonna be the same. It's gonna be $5, right? So great, smooth sailing, makes sense. But then reality hits, and So you say, great, $5 in 1998, but what happens if instead of 20 people needing that this in 1998, 30 people needed it, right? Just because you have an SGR and just because you want to contain the budget doesn't actually affect whether or not people need a service, whether or not they need some kind of help. So in this hypothetical year, great. Congress has said, we'll do $5 for this procedure. Now we have 30 procedures, so we still get our $5 times 30. But when we start 1999, when we start the next year, Congress says, well, we have the sustainable growth rate. So we're not going to go above, the cost of inflation or GDP growth. So instead of your new budget being what your last year's budget was, so it's not 5 times 30, your new budget is what last year's budget was times whatever we think the growth rate should be. So rather than adding $30 or whatever, they only added 5. And what that means is they want to stay in budget and they think, oh, well, now apparently 30 people need this per year, not 20. So that means if we're going to stay in budget, now we're only going to give you $3.67 for. So now healthcare providers are doing the same procedures, doing the same work, possibly with even more people, but they're being paid less for it. That is why everyone hated SGR. And to such an extent where this is, granted this was, the 90s was when insane partisanship started again in our lifetime, but this was before then, but still this was really a bipartisan effort. So because everyone hated this so much, basically every year from 1997 until 2017, Congress passed what they call doc fixes to basically say, we're ignoring SGR this year, or we're going to increase the budget by more than whatever the SGR increase was going to be, because otherwise there's going to be a massive revolution and the healthcare industry is going to go bankrupt. So basically this thing that was passed as part of the Balanced Budget Act in 97 never really got implemented, and the few times it actually went through in a given year, there were, very civil medical riots, so to speak. So all these doc fixes were passed. In the period, just in the 13 years of 2002 to 2015, Congress passed a doc fix. They delayed the implementation of SGR 17 times just in that 13-year period. So sometimes they delayed it by multiple years. So SGR needed to be fixed. That's the first problem that MIPS is meant to address. Okay. Questions about SGR? All right. So that's the first problem, not the problem, but that's the first thing that MIPS is meant to solve. The second leg of things that MIPS is meant to solve are tied to the Affordable Care Act. So this was passed in 2010. A lot of stuff went into effect around 2014. And the Affordable Care Act, if we think of the Balanced Budget Act as purely about controlling costs, these elements of the Affordable Care Act are all about, improving the ratio of cost to quality or just quality. So we have the Affordable Care Act introduced a few different quality and cost to quality measures, right? So there's the PQRS, the Physician Quality Reporting System. And I think a lot of these we're already familiar with because we, at Definitive Healthcare, we've been tracking this kind of stuff for a while. So the PQRS that's the system where providers have to submit their quality metrics. And there was a lot of them. In 2016, there were about 280 quality measures that PQRS measured. So that's a lot. So that's the first thing. So there's a lot of quality measures that have to be reported, and then that reporting goes to create some kind of variable score. Then there's the EHR incentive program, which we know by the moniker of meaningful use, right? So physicians, providers were required by a certain date to have an EHR and to use it regularly in meaningful ways. And after a certain point, if they didn't have it and if they didn't use it in meaningful ways, they'd be penalized. So that's another element of how of a quality metric. The use of this thing that's supposed to help is tied to compensation for different providers. So PQRS, we have meaningful use, and then we have the value-based modifier, which is a combination of quality metrics and cost to care. So it's an evaluation of quality and cost to care. So the value-based modifier is a number that modifies the amount that a physician is reimbursed for through Medicare and Medicaid as well. So you have this sustainable growth rate modifier, you have your PQRS modifier, meaningful use, hit or raise, and then a value-based modifier changing how much you're getting paid. So you have all these disparate ways of paying and calculating payments that CMS is trying to juggle, and that the poor, providers are also trying to navigate. And complexity rarely pans out in the long run. So this is where we were at when the concept or the practice or the tool of MIPS is introduced. So it was introduced, the MACRA, the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act, so people call it MACRA. MACRA was passed in 2015, and it was meant to start going to effect in 2017. And what MACRA included this QPP, Quality Payment Program. And the idea behind QPP was it consolidates all this stuff, the cost containment, the quality reporting, the relationship between quality and costs. It combined all this into the QPP. So that's good. And there are two different ways of being paid in the QPP. One is through the merit-based incentive payment model, or MIPS. And the other is the advanced alternate payment model, or APM or AAPM. We're not going to talk about APM today, but just know that right now, if someone's being paid by Medicare, by CMS, they're either in the MIPS structure or in the APM structure. And MIPS is by far the most common one. Basically, if you want to get in the APM structure, you have to apply to it. And if you suck at it, you get downgraded to MIPS, to put it politely. So that's where we're at right now. So all these things are trying to be readdressed by MACRA. MACRA introduces QPP. The main of two ways that QPP pays providers is MIPS. Questions about the context in which MIPS arises, what it's trying to solve. Cool. I'm such a good speaker that you guys have zero questions. I'm really proud of myself. Moving on. We have MIPSian, or what is MIPS meant to do? What's its point? So we know why it exists, but then how does it solve this problem of all these disparate ways of evaluating and compensating providers? So in a nutshell, right? I'm trying to get it so if for some reason your internet dies, you walk away early with all the basic stuff. So what does it do in a nutshell is it creates a single score rather than all these variable scores, and it grades on a curve. So it says, okay, everybody who's above this score gets an extra amount of money, gets a percentage increase to what we reimburse. Everyone below this score gets decreased money. So that's what MIPS is. And I drew a curve here. We'll talk a little bit why I drew that, but the idea here is that in the same way that like in high school or college, if you had a professor who graded on a curve, in a way, you're not just trying to do well on the test, you're also kind of trying to beat everybody else, because your success is also relative to everyone else's success. So that's what MIPS is. It creates the single score, compensates you based on how much higher or lower you are than that score, and then goes from there. So some more detail about the merit-based incentive payment system. So obviously it has financial implications because it has to. So we'll give you some high-level stuff, and then I'll stop being theoretical, and we'll get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of how that stuff's done. So the final scores range from 0 to 100. So it's kind of, like a curve. It's a percentage base. And it's a composite score of several different things, of 4 different things, which we'll talk about. And it's weighted. Each of those 4 things have their own different weight, and the weight changes over time. Your score this year, so you submit all your data for 2017, how well, or this year, I guess it's 2020. So, how well you did in 2020, that will determine what you get paid in 2022. So it's a bit of a lagging result. And what's interesting is y'all who asked for MIPS training started to ask for it around second half of 2019. And if you think about the timing, this makes perfect sense, right? It was passed in 2015. The first year that it started gathering data was 2017. So the data gathered about 2017 finally started affecting people in 2019. So all of a sudden in 2019, people start caring about it. There's another reason people start caring about it in 2019. For 2017 and 2018, reporting was optional. It was really, those were kind of 2 pilot years for providers to get used to MIPS. But starting in 2019, last year, it became required. So the people who are early adopters started to feel the benefit or the pain, depending on how they performed. And the people who don't want to be early adopters finally had to suck it up and report their data that year. So that's a couple reasons why 2019 was a big year for MIPS, is because of this 2-year delay and because of the 2 years of optional reporting ending. The fourth point is good scores are good and bad scores are bad, right? We talked about that. So if you have a good score, you get more money. If you have a bad score, you get less money. And an important thing to point out here is it's budget neutral. That's what I was talking about before about it being on a curve. So we are still trying to contain costs. And CMS says, rather than have this, arbitrary budget, that we'd have to kind of reverse engineer how much we pay each provider for based on what we set the budget to be, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Instead, what they say is, all right, some people are getting bonuses, some people aren't. And the people who are getting bonuses, your bonus is coming from their negative bonus. So if you're getting an extra 5% because you're good, it's because people who are below the curve, at the lower end of the curve, they're getting docked, and your 5% is coming from their negative 5%, or several providers negative 2% collectively, or what have you. So that is the element of cost control in all this, is that this is supposed to be, up until a point, and we'll talk about an exception, this is budget neutral. So in a very real way, you are competing against your fellow providers, because whoever does the best comparatively is, I don't want to say taking money out of the pocket of the ones who are doing the worst, but it could be construed that way, especially if you're the one getting your money taken away. And again, it's not money taken away, it's your reimbursement rate for a particular procedure is deducted, but you get the idea. So last thing is the performance threshold changes annually. And the idea here is, we'll go into an example in a second, but the idea here is that each year we want to get better and better, right? We're ramping up this whole concept of MIPS. So we can't, in 2017, they didn't start saying, well, if you, the performance that we're going to start docking you below is 95%. Everybody who doesn't get an A gets hit. Like, they don't want to do that. They want to get everybody used to the system, ramp everybody into it, and then hone in on what the national historical median is going to be, which basically means from 2017 until 2020, they're going to say, okay, over this trial period that we've been talking about, the average scores, or the median scores, are 78% or something. The score is 78. So starting in 22, the number that you want to hit if you don't want to get docked is 78. So up until then, though, up until 2022, these scores are slowly or quickly raising. So before I open up for questions, I'll try and elaborate on some of that stuff. So here's our 2020 example, right? We're in 2020. These are the numbers that people are targeting right now. So the threshold in 2020, I can't see, is 45, right? Like I said, we're starting low. So the threshold is 45, meaning if you get 45 out of 100, we're not going to dock you. We're not going to give you extra money, just a 0. And then all the way down to 34, you slowly get decremented, and the lowest you can get hit is -9%, right? So if you charge $100 for a procedure, or not if you charge, if the baseline for a reimbursement is $100 for a procedure, if you're at 34, you're only getting $91. And the people who are losing that $91 are paying for the people who are above 45. Does that all make sense? Okay. Above the threshold, it's a little bit more complicated. So below the threshold, it's a pretty linear progression. Like if you're 5 points below, it just slowly goes linearly. If you're above the threshold, it's a little bit less linear, meaning from 45 until 85, it's a really slow increase. It's not really like, it's not evenly risen from 45 until 100. What happens is you slowly rise, you get slow increments up until 85%. And once you hit 85%, you get quick and high increments. It's kind of like on a commission plan or something, there's a kicker. So if you're going above, it's to incentivize people to go above, you know, whatever their commission is, because you don't want someone to hit their commission and then just sit back for the rest of the year, so you give them a kicker. That's kind of the same concept. And that's called the exceptional threshold, right? So we have this, you know, performance threshold of 45, and then we have this exceptional threshold of 85. And once you hit the exceptional threshold, the kicker kicks in and you get outsized rewards. So that's what 2020, the numbers for 2020 look like. I talked about how the stakes increase, the scores increase over the years. So as you can see, 2017, we started out with really low threshold, was 3 out of 100. So again, they're trying to ease people into this. And the worst you could get docked for is 4%. The best you could get out of things is 4%. I will make a note here that no provider got plus 4%, right? Because you can't just do well, you have to basically get 100, and no provider got 100. So really the highest scores were about 2.8%, I believe. So it's still good, but keep in mind this plus or minus is the extremes of the range, and you only get that plus if you get 100%, but you get the minus if you get whatever the minimum threshold is for that year. So it's a slight distinction that you want to keep in mind. But anyway, you can see each year the performance threshold is increasing and the exceptional threshold is increasing. Although we haven't planned out past 2022 because that's when the national median is going to kick in, at least as far as we know. We haven't planned out past then, but you will notice that this year's exceptional threshold is the same as next year. So the people who created this, they guessed that it's probably going to be around 85% for the future. And that might change in 2022. We just don't know. And the idea is the performance threshold is going to be at about 60, which if you continue migrating on a curve, that's you know, below 60 is usually an F and above 60 is usually a D, right? I think. I never got D's or F's, so I wouldn't know. I'm just kidding, guys. I mean, I didn't, but it doesn't matter. So so that is the stakes increasing over the years for these MIPS thresholds. So you have this, what the payment adjustment, so the carrot or the stick, what it takes to not get any adjustment, and then what it takes to get really good adjustments. Those are the stakes over the years. I think, yeah. Questions about this kind of broad stuff of how MIPS works, from the curve, from the borrowing, from the increasing targets, the bonus, the exceptional thresholds. Anybody have any questions that they want to clarify about any of this?
Yes, Kurt, this is Tony.
Hey, Tony.
So for early adopters in either 2017 or 2018, let's say they got below threshold. what would be their incentive to be an early adopter in the first place if they suspected they would potentially get a low score?
Well, typically people who, well, so there's two answers to that, right? Those thresholds are incredibly low, right? And so they set them there to not be scared. So if you only got 2 points out of 100, better way of saying it is it's basically impossible to only get 2 points out of 100. Like if you're a practice that targets high complexity patients, by default, you get 5 points. So they set it so low at the beginning as to not scare people away for that very reason that you're talking about. That in addition to that, people who tend to opt in for stuff generally aren't underachievers. So I feel like if you opted in these first 2 years, you probably thought there was a good chance that you'd get some money. So there's a low threshold, and opt-ins tend to have disproportionate participation for certain profiles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the potential, let's say there was someone new who was brought on to turn the hospital around, and they decided, oh, I think it would be a good idea if we enrolled in this, despite everything that's going on. But you're saying it's like, even if they did, there's a very low chance of that actually being penalized if they were a very early adopter.
I mean, chances are your hospital's already failing in other ways than what CMS is reimbursing you for. I will say, if I were a little more Machiavellian, if I were someone who was in charge of quality, and I wanted to get my money people to do what I wanted them to do, I might put our money where our quality is. So I might lobby to have us join MIPS and have us lose money to get them to say, oh crap, we need to spend more money so we don't lose more money. If I were more Machiavellian and interested in politics, that's another thing, that's another incentive I might have to have us join MIPS, even if I'm unsure about how we'll do.
Gotcha.
But I don't think like that, Tony, so stop making me think like
that. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Cool. Okay, so like I said, it's not going to take very long. We're doing really well. Let's go to the McCann-MIPS, if you will, or how the actual score is calculated. So we know what the score means. We know why it exists. We know what it implies, right? So again, if your internet dies right now, you know enough to speak intelligently about why people care about MIPS, why it's all the, not all the rage, why they're talking about it so much lately. That's what you know. And right now we're going to talk about what goes into that score, right? Because it's 0 to 100. Where does that number come from? That's what we're going to talk about right now. And I will say at this point, we're going to keep it pretty high level, because each of these, not only each of the weighted subscores you could do a whole lecture on, you could do a whole lecture on each of the elements of the weighted subscore. So we're going to keep it pretty high level. And if you guys want to learn more about any of these subscores, just let me know and we can do another thing, or at the very least I can give you some resources. So we'll keep it pretty high level, but this is how the MIPS score is calculated. So it is a combination of 4 elements, and we'll just talk about them one at a time. So the first is quality, right? Like I'm talking about, a lot of this is aimed at quality because, MACRA, and by extension QPP, and by extension MIPS, is all replacing a lot of the numbers introduced by the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of those are about quality. So obviously a portion of this has to be about quality. So and the numbers I'm about to give you are for kind of a typical provider. There are different thresholds or different requirements for very small providers, but I'm going to give you the broad strokes so that you know what applies to most people. So you have to report as a provider 6 measures, and there's a whole list of measures, and it has to be some kind of high priority measure. And if you report high priority measures, you get extra points, basically. So if you're like, well, the only 6 things we're good at don't matter, so we're going to report those 6 things, great. We'll score you based on those, but you don't get, brownie points for giving us useless information. That's kind of how it works. So right now, you choose to report 6 measures, and each measure has an outcome attached to it that you report. And and you report all or 70% of all eligible cases that are tied to that measure. And this is an important distinction because even though this is about how you get paid from CMS, right? This is about Medicare and Medicaid percentage increase or decrease. They already know their data. They don't need you to report what the claims are for them. They want all payer claims. So if you're reporting on, the readmission for heart failure or something, they're not just interested in the Medicare and Medicaid patients. They want every patient because they want a complete view of you as a provider. So the measures that you're reporting on as a provider, you have to report at least 70% of all your eligible cases. And CMS has their own benchmarks that they compare this against. Again, like I said, this is where it gets a little bit competitive, right? Because it's not just, are you good or are you bad? It's a benchmark is a moving thing. It's dependent on a market, right? So are you good this year might not mean the same thing as are you good next year. So that's the quality side of it. You as a provider have to report 6 measures, and each measure has outcomes tied to it. And you get bonus points for high priority measures. And you have to include at least 70% of all eligible cases, even if they're not related to, even if they're not, CMS claims. Questions about the quality metrics or the quality component? Okay. Next is cost, right? We never talk about quality without talking about cost, because what's the point? So cost is, luckily for providers, they don't actually have to provide data on this. So of the 4 elements, they don't have to provide data on costs. The other ones they do. And because they don't provide data, this is entirely based on CMS claims, Medicare and Medicaid claims. So CMS has their magic formulas that they come up with, and they measure 20 cost measures. I put a few of the most obvious ones here. So there's MSPB, or Medicare spending per beneficiary clinician. So basically, is the doctor expensive? Total per capita cost, meaning are the patients expensive? And then episode-based measures. So for this type of code, what are you charging up? What are you running? And again, all that data that they already have, they compare that against benchmarks, against a curve that's evolving. So that's the cost measure. Pretty straightforward because that's very similar to what they've done in the past. Questions about that? Righteous. Cool. Next are these two are new. These were introduced by Macro. So this is PI, or promoting interoperability. The idea here is, to promote interoperability. The idea here is to make sure that, to encourage providers to play nice, right? To share data, it's trying to accomplish what originally, meaningful use was trying to accomplish, and all that stuff. So they basically I won't say rebranded. They replaced meaningful use with this CEHRT, and this is the new measure that they assess with, and it covers things like, are you e-prescribing? I don't know why you wouldn't, because it's so much easier, but are you doing that? Do you have a patient exchange? Like, I don't know if you guys do, but my physicians have web portals. If you have a question, you go to the portal, you submit the question. If you need a refill, you go to the portal and you do the refill. So do you have a patient exchange? How well is it used? How well is it maintained? And then there's health information exchange. So that's not a patient portal. That is, it's an HIE, right? This is, are you sharing amongst providers? So, from your specialist to your PCP, are they talking electronically? So that's the health information exchange. You get scored on that. And you also get scored on public health and clinical data exchange, which is relatively new, and I also like a lot. So that's not, are you talking to the patients and are you talking to each other? This is, are you reporting critical health data to the government? In the midst of a pandemic, this kind of incentive Makes a lot of sense, right? Are you sharing critical stuff on a national scale? So they are scored on all these different things, and that is the PI score, the Promoting Interoperability Score. Questions about that? Like I said, each of these elements could be its own hour training. Last but not least is, again, new, because before they were really just based on quality. They were judged on quality and cost. A new thing is the IA score, the Improvement Activity Score. And this, this might change, but at least from 2017 until 2021, the idea here is there's a list of 107 things. And for the average provider, we want you to do 2 of those things. And you will submit a report to us on what you did and what are the outcomes. And we will score you based on your report. Going along with my grading on a curve analogy, these are your term papers or whatever, right? So this is not how you're doing your day-to-day thing. This is what you're doing to improve things in the long term, which is smart from a healthcare infrastructure standpoint, but it's also smart from the provider standpoint, because if the metric by which you're graded, if the curve shifts, you actually want to make sure you're improving, because otherwise you could quickly fall behind. And once you fall behind, it can be a little bit of a death spiral because you're getting paid less money. So it is also structured, at least, or meant to at least, be good for the providers too, because it keeps them from going behind the curve. I made a note here, there's medium weight versus high weight, similar to how there's priority measures in quality that get you bonus points. Of that list of 107 activities, some get you more points than others. If it's a high weight initiative, you get more points. So those are all the elements that go into the MIPS calculation. I made a little note there at the bottom that there's a couple bonuses, right? There's a small practice bonus. So the idea here is CMS recognizes that if you're a small practice, you just don't have the resources of a massive hospital or a network. So they say, we're just gonna, if you're a small practice, you get 5 points free, right? It's like the SATs, you get some number of points for writing your name. That's kind of like the small practice bonus. And there's another one, that's the complex patient bonus. I mentioned that earlier. So if you deal with really incredibly complex patients, like if rare cancers or whatever, in the same sense that a small practice doesn't have a lot of resources, complex patients don't have a lot of infrastructural resources, right? They don't have a billion different, not a billion, but they don't have a whole bunch of different companies constantly improving their medication because there's a big market for it, so there's a financial incentive for it, right? They have maybe one company researching medicine, and it might stop researching it this year because there's no market for it, right? So that's a little bit of a sop to the complex patient providers. So they also get an automatic 5 points, right? So if you are a small practice that focuses on complex patients, you start out the game with 10 points. Does that make sense? Cool. So let's give you an example, right? I've given you high levels, explained a little bit. Let's get some numbers so you can start to see how they fit in. Over the years, these are how those different things have been weighted. So as you see, quality started in 2017 as a really strong weight. So all those quality things that you reported on are super important. And then cost started out relatively low. But as the years have progressed, quality and cost are equalizing a little bit. So you don't just have to be good, you also got to be good about claims. And there's some things to think about here. So remember, they don't have to report claims for cost, right? Cost is entirely generated by CMS's claims. And the idea here is that this is kind of going towards preventive medicine philosophy. So the idea here is, if you focus on quality early up, if you focus on quality and you're preventive, claims should go down, right? That's just the basic philosophy of preventive medicine. Claims should go down, so your cost should decrease, meaning your cost score should increase. So the idea here is qualities, we're all, at least until 2021, and we're hoping that it looks about the same after 2021. Quality is going to matter a little bit more than cost, but cost is going to matter more and more as the years go on, and cost meaning claims. And PI and IA, those are meant to just consistently be 25% and 15%. So we don't want quality and cost to be the only things that matter. We don't want someone to invest early in improvements in 2017, and then in 2022, improvements are worth 5%. And you're like, why did I waste my time and money doing this initiative and reporting on it when it doesn't get me anything in the long run? So the macro was set up, or QPP was set up, so that PI and IA are always going to be 40%, quality and cost are always going to be 40%, and we can play with that interchange. So as you see in 2020, these are the weightings. Questions about any of that? Because we're about to get kind of a real life example that hopefully puts everything together. And I know that, you know, I put all these slides together so they make sense to me, but do they make sense to you? Are you ready for the real world example? Or not real world, but for my pretend world example? Cool. So here's my pretend world example, right? I am a large practice that deals with very complex patients. And on the left side, I have, you know, the 4 elements that everyone's judged on, and then I include the little bonuses there so you can see all the things that get added together. Quality and cost, the score is always 0 to 100%, right? Because that's the grading on a curve, right? There's the threshold, there's this benchmark that CMS is determining for both of those, and wherever I'm at in that benchmark is what my number is going to be. So in this example, I am super good at quality. I'm, you know, 70th percentile of quality. And because in 2020, that's 40% weighted, that gets me 20 points, right? 70 times 0.4, 28 points. Then there's cost. So I'm great at quality, but I'm a little bit more expensive. I have more claims than my peers. So I'm at the 40th percentile there. And in 2020, cost is weighted at 20%. So I get 8 points. Then we're going to interoperability, right, PI. That isn't percentage based, that just has a score of 0 to 105. It's not how well are you doing versus your peers, it's just how many points did you earn, right? How well did you do on, you know, the patient portal, the health information exchange, and the public health, and the e-prescriptions and all that fun stuff. So you can earn up to 105 points there. So I'm super high tech, I'm amazing, so I got 80 out of that. That being said, 80 points, PI is only weighted at 25% in 2020. So that actually ends me up at 20% weighted. Hopefully, I don't need to repeat myself for this last one, but I'm going to, but you get the idea, right? So with improvement initiatives, that you can cap out at 40, right? So it's 0 to 40. It's not benchmarked, it's just there's a rubric. Did you pick a high value thing? If you picked a high value thing, you can get more points. If you didn't, you can get fewer points. So I picked 2 high value initiatives that I was gonna do, and I knocked it out of the park this year. So I report on that, I get all 40 points, but it's only 50% weighted, so I walk away with 6 points. I'm not a small practice, but I have complex patients, so I get an extra 5 points there. This all comes together, I get a MIPS score of 67. 2020, we know that the PT, the performance threshold, is 45. So great, I beat 45, so I'm walking away with extra money. I'm gonna get plus something. That being said, I didn't get to the exceptional threshold of 85, so I'm not gonna get plus a lot, right? Even though the plus or minus of 2020 is -9 plus 9, or I guess -9 plus 9, I don't know how the camera works. -9 plus 9, even though I'm well above actually, I'm halfway to 85%, I'm not getting halfway to 9%, right? Because it's the small increment up until I hit 85 and then it's big increment. So in my example, because I got a 67 in 2020, that means in 2022, my score is, my reimbursements are increased by 3%. So if in 2021, or if they've, you know, set aside that this procedure is $100, in 2022, I'm getting $103 for that procedure. I think, let me double check. I think that's it. We'll have a MIPS discussion right now. I couldn't stop myself from putting another one in there. So what kind of questions do you have? What comments do you have? What's unclear? What's clear, but you kind of want to talk about, because there's lots of that. I'm happy to go over anything with you, or in worst case scenario, my answer is I don't know, and I'll look it up. So what do you got for me?
I want to create a help center article more in depth here. Those are my thoughts.
That's like 20 health center articles. So let me know if I can help you narrow it down a little bit.
Yep.
But yeah, and again, I'm not an expert, but that's probably, I don't know, 2 days of research, which is more than most people have time to do. So yeah.
Yeah. Kurt, I have a question again. Tony. So I'm a little confused about the interoperability incentive combined with things being on a curve. Like, how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so I apologize if it was unclear about that. So the curve element comes from cost and quality, and interoperability, that's more based on rubrics, right? So so that part isn't graded on the curve, but because everything is combined, it does get affected by the score. Does that make sense? So it's not like for interoperability and for the improvement initiatives, it's not like, it's not going to be a bell curve of 0 points and 40 points and most people are at 20. That's not how that's going to work at all. It's just however many points you earned, that's how many points you earned. So maybe one way of thinking about it is, if you want to crunch down a MIPS score into, you could say like MIPS A and MIPS B if you want. MIPS A being cost and quality, which are completely a curve. And then MIPS B is the improvement initiatives and the interoperability and your small business and your complex patient all gets added onto that curve to skew the curve a little bit in a more objective way. Does that make sense? Did I explain that?
Yes, that does help. And I just anticipate people being confused by that.
Oh yeah.
So, Deja, I think that might be worth noting.
Other questions? All right. Well, I mean, that's all I had for you today. If you do want to dive into more detail about any of this stuff, let me know. Like I said, I could provide you resources. If enough people are interested in something, we could do another training. And happy to be a resource for you guys. So everyone have an excellent weekend, and see you around. Be safe.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you.
Thanks.